All right, welcome to a quick lecture about agriculture in more developed countries, the MDCs. The slides were designed to accompany the book The Cultural Landscape, and I am, of course, Chris Gall. I'll be your lecturer for the afternoon. So, we talk about agriculture in more developed countries. A handful of things we need to look at. One is that most agriculture in more developed countries takes one of two forms. Okay, either it's huge monocultures or it's going to be a mixed crop and livestock farming operation. And in those mixed crop and livestock farming, what you'll find is that most of the land is devoted to crops, but most of the profits derives from the livestock. And livestock, again, any animal that's being sold for essentially for meat production. Okay. We also are going to look just a touch at dairy farming, right, and the regional distribution of dairying. We call that the milk shed. And remember, milk is one of those things that only keeps for so long. And even with modern transportation techniques, we still, for the most part, the milk that we drink is produced within a relatively local area. Part of the trick with dairy farming is that it's really a very expensive process. Okay, first of all, it's labor intensive, which means either you need a whole lot of farm hands to make your operation workable, or you need a whole lot of machinery. And for the most part, people have opted for machinery because in the long haul it's actually cheaper and more reliable. And then the other trick, especially when we're looking, say, here in the United States, is that for large parts of the country, most of the country, you can't just send your cattle out to feed all winter like you can in the summer, right? Cattle, of course, eat grass or grains or things like that. And so during the winter, you have to pay for winter feed. You can't just send them out to forage. So that becomes a huge problem for dairy farmers as they're trying to figure out and decide whether or not they can continue their operations. So the next several slides, what we're going to actually do is take a look at a few different products. It's the next 2 or 3 slides, I forget exactly how many, and just look at where are they being developed or where are they being grown in the more developed and the developing world. Okay, and we're going to look at a few just kind of key products that get used for a whole lot of stuff. So our first product here is corn, also known as maize, and when we look at where's corn being grown in the developed world, of course the United States. The United States government, by the way, pays huge subsidies to corn growers to keep the price of corn down so that we can use it for things like ethanol for our cars. So we use corn's a big biofuel. We also use it as a basis for a lot of sweeteners, as you know if you've ever read the ingredients list on pretty much any food. One of the other big areas that right, and you can see other developed areas that do a lot of corn production. Canada, by the way, I know they color all of Canada, they color all of Alaska. We don't grow corn in Alaska. Growing season isn't long enough for the most part. Same thing with northern Canada. Okay, Mexico grows a lot of corn, one of the key foods down there. If we look at Europe for our more developed world, what you'll see is that a lot of it's grown in France. And France actually has a fairly sizable agricultural sector, which is competitive largely through the use of subsidies from the European Union. If we start moving outside the developed world and we start looking at the developing world, Mexico, again, reasonably large producer. Brazil, same thing. China's a huge producer, as is India, and those are related to population numbers. Okay, so they've got a lot of people to produce, or they've got a lot of people to feed, sorry. And so corn is one of the ways in which they do that. And we're going to go ahead and take a quick look at milk production. And like I said, remember, milk is one of those foods that tends to be consumed close to where it's produced. So if we look at the more developed world, right, we see a lot in the United States. The US actually is a huge milk consumer. largely because we're one of those rare countries where we actually encourage people to drink it past childhood. If you look at Europe, you can see there's a lot of milk consumed in Europe. And a lot of that, and remember, when we talk about milk production, we're not just talking about milk, we're also talking about yogurt, we're talking about cheese, any of those products that can be made from milk. All right. Somehow, not surprising, India is one of the world's biggest milk producers. Kind of makes sense since cows are sacred and there's a whole lot of cows in India, right? China's huge milk producer, Russia's big milk producer. Again, these are areas with large agricultural industries. Somehow not surprising that most of Africa doesn't produce a lot of milk. Cattle in the form of cows, and by and large what we're looking at here is cow milk, is not a huge thing in Africa, partially because conditions are just not conducive to it, and also just because cows tend to get used for labor or for meat, but milk is not widely consumed there as a product, so that makes sense then that they don't produce as much milk throughout large parts of Africa. Okay, so a few other different types of agriculture that are worth talking about in more developed countries. One is grain farming. Interestingly enough, the largest commercial producer of grain in the entire world is the United States, followed closely by areas like, I believe, the Ukraine. And we use a huge amount of grain, and a lot of the grain we grow actually goes into producing or into feeding livestock, because the nice thing about livestock is that they can survive in otherwise marginal areas, but the trick is, again, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, you need to be able to feed them, and forage can't be found throughout large parts of the United States in the winter. In addition to the fact that we also tend to do things like fatten our beef up before we butcher it, and so they do that in feedlots, and feedlots of course require lots of grain. We see Mediterranean agriculture actually here in the United States, in Chile, not just around the Mediterranean basin, and that's based on horticulture, which is basically the planting of specific plants, a lot of gardening, but it's not necessarily that huge, large scale agriculture that you're used to seeing, right? It's more like horticulture is closer to gardening in a lot of ways. But then you also see here in the United States and in most of the more developed world is you see a lot of commercial gardening and a lot of commercial farming. And by commercial gardening, I'm talking about the flowers you go and buy at the store, talking about just those products that sometimes people grow and will sell at the local farmers market and the like. Right, you see a lot of fruit farming, deliberately growing fruit in order to feed people here in the US, and we do that a lot of times through truck farming. And truck farming just basically means that you're loading your agriculture up in a truck, or your products up in a truck, and you're moving them to the market. Okay, so Northeast United States, for instance, is a big area where truck farming occurs, largely related to fruits and vegetables. So one last product to take a look at, and that is wheat. Okay, so we talked a little bit about grain earlier, and wheat is similarly related. And not surprisingly, and this shouldn't be surprising, that we're seeing a lot of those same areas that produce a lot of grain, that produce a lot of milk and the like, are also same areas that are producing a lot of wheat. Again, these are areas with large agricultural sectors that are oftentimes, for the most part, commercialized, right? Certainly the United States is that way. France, Germany, Britain are that way. Russia's huge agricultural sector. China's agricultural sector, even though a large chunk of it is subsistence based, what you probably didn't know about China is you can actually kind of split it almost down the middle, and there's the noodle part of China and the rice part of China. And so a lot of people in China live on wheat-based noodles, not the rice that we stereotypically associate with China. So this has just been kind of a quick review, a little bit of a talk about agriculture in more developed countries and what you can find and some of where you can find it. If you have any questions, by all means, feel free to come see me and ask them in class, and I would be delighted to do anything I can to help you out.